My Lords, firstly, I just wanted to welcome the amendment by Lord Allen and his motivation, because throughout this bill, I am concerned about the wrong targets being caught up. And I was grateful to hear of that recognition that there will be people who are talking about their problems of self-harm that could end up being targeted, which nobody would ever intend. These are things that need to be taken seriously. And in that sense, I was slightly concerned by the motivation by the noble Baroness Burt of Solihull in relation to the reckless amendment, inasmuch as the argument was, well, the recklessness standard is easier to prove, and I'm always worried about things that make things easier to prosecute someone rather than that there's a really just reason for that prosecution. One of the things that I'm concerned about here, by the way, is that, as we know, who is often involved in the sending of these images, they're often immature and very foolish young men. And I'm concerned about them being criminalised, or lowering the threshold at which we criminalise, potentially destroying their lives, by the way, because if you have a criminal record, it's not good. Even though I am not in any way trying to tolerate what they're doing, and I do think it's obviously important that we take that on. But I think that there is a danger that this law does become a mechanism through which people, I'm afraid, sometimes try and resolve a whole range of social problems, which gets me on really to responding, I suppose, to the speech that's just been made by the noble Lady Baroness Kennedy of the Shores, and I continue to be concerned about this question of trying to criminalise indirect threats. The point about somebody who sends a direct threat is that we can see at least the connection between that direct threat and the possibility of action. It's the same sort of thing that we have at least considered historically in relation to incitement. And I understand that where there is a situation where your physical being is threatened by words, physically a practical thing can happen, and that is to be taken very seriously. The problem I have with the indirect threat of somebody who'll say something like, you know, that smile should be taken off your face, it can be arranged, all of these kind of indirect and incredibly unpleasant, by the way, kind of comments, is that there is clearly no link between that and a specific action. It might use the violent language, but it's not in any way directly. I mean, it's an indirect, it could be arranged, I wish it would happen. Now, if anyone is on social media, which I'm sure that you all are, you will know that I follow fairly carefully what people from different political parties say about each other. I mean, I don't know if you've ever followed the kind of things that are said about the government and their ministers. But it's not even indirect, really. But anyway, and named often, and in that instance, nothing to do with women. But it's pretty violent and vile. And by the way, I've also followed what's said about the opposition benches, and it can be pretty violent and vile. I mean, and including language that implies that, you know, they wish people were the subject of quite intense violence without going into it. So my concern is, and so that happens, I don't approve, obviously. I also do not think that pylons are pleasant to be on the receiving end of, and I understand how they happen. But I do think that if you criminalise pylons on social media, you are openly criminalising censorship. And what's worse, in my mind, is that we are allowing the conflation of words and actions into the same area, where you basically say that what you say or what you think is the same as acting on it, as the criminal law would see it. And we've already seen a very dangerous trend recently which is particularly popular in the endless arguments over identity politics and the kind of disputes that happen, where people will say that speech is violence. And because they'll say your speech, or for example, the speaker that was invited, this happened indeed has happened indeed to a number of gender-critical feminists, in this instance women, who have gone to speak in good faith at universities as they were invited. They've been told that their speech was violence, indistinguishable from violence, that made students at the university feel under threat and unsafe, and it was the equivalent of being attacked. Once you make that distinction, then guess what? The response to that speech can be is to use violence, because you can't tell the difference between it. And indeed, that happened and has happened around a number of university actions where speakers were physically, and their supporters were physically assaulted by people who said that they were using self-defence against speech that they said was violent. So I just get nervous that this is a slippery slope, and that we should not certainly go anywhere near it on the face of legislation. And finally, I do agree that we should tackle the culture of people piling on and using this kind of language, but I think it's a cultural and social question, and that what we require is moral leadership and courage in the face of this, in calling it out, arguing against it, and so on. I think it is wrong to use the law to send messages, because I think it's an abdication of that moral leadership. I think it's actually a cop-out, let alone dangerous in terms of what's criminalised. So I would urge you to reject those amendments.
My Lords, I rise very